The morning sun painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange as Mr. James Wilson stepped out of his modest two-story home. At 68 years old, he moved with a grace that seemed to defy time itself, though the slight silver streaks in his dark hair and the gentle wrinkles around his eyes told stories of a life well lived. He gently closed his front door, careful not to wake his sleeping wife of 40 years, and began his daily ritual, a peaceful morning walk through Riverside Park. The early autumn air carried a crisp freshness that made his morning walks even more enjoyable. Mr. Wilson smiled softly as he passed Mrs. Chen watering her prize roses, exchanging their usual morning waves. She had been his neighbor for the past 15 years, and like clockwork, she was always tending to her garden at dawn. These small, consistent moments made his neighborhood feel like home, despite the recent changes he noticed. As he walked, his mind drifted to the dojo where he'd spent over 4 decades teaching. Though officially retired now, he couldn't help but maintain the disciplined routine that martial arts had instilled in him. His students used to joke that he moved like a cat, silent and purposeful, even when just walking to get a glass of water. The memory brought a warm chuckle to his lips. The park entrance welcomed him with its familiar iron archway, the morning dew still clinging to the decorative vines that wrapped around it. Mr. Wilson paused briefly to do his morning stretches, his movements fluid and controlled. A young jogger passed by, earbuds in place, offering a respectful nod which Mr. Wilson returned with a gentle smile. These quiet moments were what he treasured most about his morning routine. His path took him past the old fountain, its waters catching the early morning light. He remembered bringing his own children here years ago, teaching them to throw pennies and make wishes. Now grown with families of their own, they still teased him about never missing his morning walk, rain or shine. "Dad's more reliable than the mailman," his youngest would say at family gatherings. As he walked, Mr. Wilson reflected on his journey, from a young boy learning karate in his grandfather's backyard to becoming an 8th-degree black belt who trained military personnel. His life had been dedicated to mastering not just the physical aspects of martial arts, but its deeper teachings of peace, wisdom, and respect. He'd seen the transformation martial arts could bring to troubled souls, having taught countless students over the years who came to him angry at the world and left with a sense of purpose and inner peace. The sound of distant laughter caught his attention, pulling him from his thoughts. The park was getting busier now, as it usually did around this time. Young parents pushing strollers, elderly couples walking hand in hand, and students rushing to early morning classes all began to fill the paths. Mr. Wilson checked his watch, a well-worn timepiece his wife had given him on their 25th anniversary, and noted it was time to begin his return journey. The morning light had fully bloomed now, warming his face as he turned onto the path that would lead him home. He could smell fresh bread from the local bakery carried on the breeze, mixing with the scent of blooming flowers from the park's gardens. These simple pleasures make him grateful for each day, each moment of peace and beauty in a world that sometimes seemed to be moving too fast. Little did Mr. Wilson know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. As he rounded the corner near the park's eastern entrance, the sound of approaching footsteps behind him broke through the morning calm. The peaceful start to his day was about to take an unexpected turn, though his decades of training had prepared him for moments exactly like this. The peaceful morning atmosphere shattered as loud voices echoed through the park. Brad Collins and his 3 friends had been hanging around the east entrance since sunrise, their school backpacks tossed carelessly under a nearby bench. They weren't there to study or enjoy the morning. These teenagers had developed a reputation for causing trouble in the neighborhood over the past few months. Brad, wearing his usual red baseball cap backwards and oversized leather jacket despite the mild weather, spotted Mr. Wilson first. He nudged his friend Tom, who was busy trying to balance on the park bench's backrest. "Hey, check it out," Brad whispered, a mischievous glint in his eyes. The other 2 boys, Chris and Alex, looked up from their phones, following Brad's gaze. They'd been getting bolder lately, their pranks escalating from harmless jokes to increasingly mean-spirited acts. Just last week, they'd made Mrs. Chen cry by destroying her rose bushes, though no one could prove it was them. The sight of Mr. Wilson, walking alone in his simple gray tracksuit, seemed to them like an easy target for their morning entertainment. "Watch this," Brad said, pushing himself off the bench. The others followed, like shadows drawn to his confidence. They began trailing Mr. Wilson, keeping about 20 feet behind him at first. Brad started making exaggerated movements, mimicking the elderly man's walking style, while his friends snickered behind their hands. The morning dog walkers and joggers who witnessed this scene quickened their pace and looked away. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, but no one stepped in. This was exactly what the boys counted on: people's reluctance to get involved. Their previous encounters had taught them that most people would rather pretend not to see than confront a group of rowdy teenagers. "Hey, old-timer," Brett called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Learning to walk again?" The other boys laughed, encouraged by their leader's boldness. They began closing the distance between themselves and Mr. Wilson, their steps getting quicker, more purposeful. Mr. Wilson continued his walk, his pace unchanged, his posture remaining dignified. This seemed to irritate Brad even more. Usually their targets would show fear, walk faster, or at least acknowledge their presence. The elderly man's calm demeanor felt like a challenge. The boys spread out, instinctively forming a loose circle around their target. Chris and Alex moved to the sides while Tom flanked from the left, leaving Brad to take the lead. Their shoes scuffed against the park's paved path, breaking the morning quiet with each step. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Can't hear us?" Brad taunted, his voice taking on an ugly edge. The other boys joined in, adding their own cruel comments. Their words grew increasingly hostile, laced with racial slurs that made a nearby mother hurriedly push her stroller in the opposite direction. The morning sun now felt harsh rather than peaceful, casting long shadows behind the boys as they moved. The park's usual friendly atmosphere had transformed into something tense and uncomfortable. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet, as if sensing the shift in the air. Mr. Wilson's steady breathing remained unchanged as he walked, though his eyes carefully tracked the movement of each boy in his peripheral vision. Years of training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings without appearing to pay attention. He noticed how Brad's confident swagger masked an uncertainty in his steps, how Tom kept looking around nervously, and how Chris and Alex seemed to be more focused on matching Brad's behavior than actually wanting to cause trouble. The group had nearly reached the park's central fountain now, its rushing water providing a backdrop to the mounting tension. The early morning crowd had thinned out in this section of the park, leaving fewer witnesses to what was unfolding. Brad took this as his cue to escalate the situation, moving closer to Mr. Wilson with each step. What the teenagers didn't notice was the subtle shift in Mr. Wilson's movement, the slightly wider stance, the gentle adjustment of his balance, the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders. These were the instinctive preparations of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of self-defense, though to untrained eyes, he appeared to be simply continuing his morning walk. The boys were about to learn a valuable lesson, though not the one they had expected to teach that morning. As they closed in around Mr. Wilson near the fountain, the air grew thick with tension. The moment was building towards something that would change not just their morning, but their entire perspective on life. The morning had grown unusually quiet around the fountain, save for the gentle splashing of water and the scuffing of sneakers against concrete. Mr. Wilson stood calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides, as the four teenagers completed their circle around him. He could feel the spray from the fountain carried by the breeze, a cool mist that somehow made the moment feel more real. Brad stepped forward, his red cap casting a shadow over his face. "What's the matter, old man?" Too scared to say anything, his voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying a nervousness that his tough exterior tried to hide. The other boys shifted their weight from foot to foot, their earlier bravado beginning to feel hollow in the face of Mr. Wilson's unwavering composure. Mr. Wilson took a slow, deliberate breath. He'd faced moments like this before, not just in his years of martial arts training, but throughout his life. Each time, he'd learned something new about human nature, about fear, about anger, and about the power of choosing how to respond. His eyes met Brad's, and for a brief moment, the teenager saw something in them that made him take half a step back. "Young men," Mr. Wilson spoke for the first time, his voice calm and clear as the morning air. "I've spent 60 years practicing the art of self-defense." He adjusted his stance slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone trained would notice its significance. "Please reconsider your actions." Tom, standing to the left, let out a forced laugh that sounded more like a nervous hiccup. 60 years? You must have started when dinosaurs were around. The joke fell flat, and even Chris and Alex's attempted chuckles died quickly in their throats. Mr. Wilson's lips curved into a slight smile, but his eyes remained serious. Age brings many things, young man. Wisdom, patience. He paused, letting his words hang in the air, and experience. Brad, feeling his authority over the group slipping, tried to regain control of the situation. Oh yeah? What's your experience gonna do against 4 of us? He puffed out his chest, but his voice wavered just enough to be noticeable. I've taught hundreds of students over the years, Mr. Wilson continued, his tone reminiscent of his days in the dojo. Many of them started exactly where you are now. Angry, looking for ways to prove themselves, thinking that strength comes from making others feel small. Chris shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Brad and Mr. Wilson. The elderly man's words seemed to strike a chord, making him remember his younger brother, who he used to protect from bullies before he became one himself. Each morning, I walk this path to remember what my grandfather taught me, Mr. Wilson went on, his voice taking on a gentler tone. He showed me that true strength isn't about intimidation or fear. It's about respect, for others and for yourself. Alex, the quietest of the group, found himself lowering his gaze. Something about the way Mr. Wilson spoke reminded him of his own grandfather, who had passed away last year. The memory made his chest tight with an emotion he didn't want to acknowledge. You have a choice right now, Mr. Wilson continued, making eye contact with each boy in turn. You can walk away from this moment having learned something valuable, or you can make a mistake that will teach you something the hard way. The fountain's spray caught the sunlight, creating a brief rainbow that seemed to underscore the significance of the moment. Brad looked around at his friends, seeing the uncertainty in their faces, the way they seemed to be actually listening to this man they'd intended to harass. But pride is a powerful force, especially in young hearts trying to prove themselves. Brad felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were supposed to be in control, not standing here being lectured by their intended target. You talk too much, old man, Brad spat out, trying to ignore the tremor in his hands. Maybe we need to teach you a lesson instead. He took a step forward, his sneakers squeaking against the damp pavement. Mr. Wilson remained perfectly still, but something changed in his presence, a subtle shift that made the air feel electric. His next words came out soft but clear, carrying to each of the boys despite the fountain's background noise. I was hoping you wouldn't make that choice. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the park's paths. In that moment, as Brad's fists clenched and his friends tensed behind him, time seemed to slow down. The choices of the past few minutes had set something in motion that would change all of their lives forever, though not in the way any of them expected. The tension around the fountain finally broke when Brad lunged forward, his frustration overriding his better judgment. His sneakers squeaked against the damp pavement as he aimed a clumsy shove at Mr. Wilson's chest. What happened next seemed to defy everything the teenagers thought they knew about elderly people and physics itself. Mr. Wilson's movement was so smooth it almost looked like a dance step. He shifted slightly to the right, his left hand gently redirecting Brad's momentum. The teenager's push met nothing but air, and his own force carried him stumbling forward, his red cap falling to the ground. Brad windmilled his arms, trying to catch his balance, only to find himself sitting on the pavement, completely unharmed but thoroughly confused. What the? Tom started, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at Chris and Alex, who seemed equally stunned. The 3 boys hadn't moved, their bodies frozen in place like statues in the morning light. That was a basic redirection, Mr. Wilson explained calmly, his breathing as steady as if he was still on his morning walk. No force needed, just using your opponent's energy against them. He stood in the same relaxed pose, hands now clasped behind his back, looking at each boy in turn. Chris, trying to prove his loyalty to Brad, came forward next. He was more cautious, throwing a wild punch that he'd learned from watching too many action movies. Mr. Wilson simply wasn't there when the punch arrived. Instead, Chris found his arm caught in a gentle but firm grip, and before he knew what was happening, he was sitting next to Brad, more embarrassed than hurt. Tom and Alex exchanged nervous glances. the situation had shifted dramatically from their original plan of intimidating an elderly man. Now they were witnessing something that looked like it came straight out of a kung fu movie, except this was real, and it was happening in their neighborhood park on a regular Tuesday morning. "Come on, guys, all at once," Brad shouted, scrambling to his feet, his face red with embarrassment. His voice cracked with a mix of fear and wounded pride. The 4 teenagers charged together, thinking that surely they could overwhelm one elderly man through sheer numbers. What followed was like a carefully choreographed dance, with Mr. Wilson as the calm center of a chaotic storm. He stepped and turned, each movement precise and purposeful. The boys found themselves bumping into each other, their attacks meeting empty air or being gently deflected. Not once did Mr. Wilson throw a punch or kick. He simply wasn't where their attacks landed, and somehow they kept losing their balance or running into each other. Within moments, all 4 teenagers were sitting on the ground again, out of breath and completely unhurt except for their pride. Mr. Wilson stood calmly in their midst, not even having broken a sweat. The fountain continued its peaceful splashing behind them, a strange soundtrack to what had just happened. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, phones raised to record what they probably thought would be a tragic incident of elder abuse. Instead, they had witnessed something extraordinary. A masterclass in non-violent self-defense that would likely become a viral sensation by lunchtime. How did you do that?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The anger had drained from his face, replaced by something that looked like awe. Mr. Wilson bent down and picked up Brad's fallen cap, dusting it off carefully. 60 years of practice, he said simply, holding the cap out to Brad. And learning that the best fight is the one where nobody gets hurt. Brad stared at his cap, then at Mr. Wilson, his whole worldview visibly shaking. The tough guy persona he'd built up over the past few months seemed to crack, revealing the uncertain teenager underneath. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the cap. "Young man," Mr. Wilson continued, his voice gentle but firm, "strength isn't about being able to push others down. It's about being able to stay standing while helping others up." He extended his other hand to Brad, offering to help him to his feet. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the park's paths. The other 3 boys watched in stunned silence as their leader faced a choice that would define more than just this moment. The crowd held their breath, phones still recording, as Brad looked at the offered hand, his own internal struggle visible on his face. The morning air felt different now as the 4 teenagers sat on the concrete benches near the fountain, their earlier bravado completely deflated. Brad held his red cap in his hands, turning it over and over, unable to meet Mr. Wilson's eyes. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, though a few stayed behind, curious to see what would happen next. Mr. Wilson stood before them, his presence somehow both commanding and gentle at the same time. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a few drops of fountain spray from his face before speaking. "Would you like to know what my grandfather told me when I was about your age?" The boys looked up, surprised by the question. They'd expected anger, lectures, maybe even threats to call the police. Instead, they found themselves drawn into a story they hadn't known they needed to hear. "I was angry too, back then," Mr. Wilson continued, sitting down on a nearby bench. "Thought the whole world was against me. Used to pick fights just to prove I was strong." He smiled slightly at the memory. "Then one day, I picked a fight with the wrong person, or the right one, as it turned out." Tom shifted in his seat, the morning sun warming his back. Something in Mr. Wilson's voice made him think of his own father, who worked 2 jobs and always seemed too tired to talk anymore. "My grandfather was watching that day," Mr. Wilson went on. "He saw me get knocked down, not just once, but 7 times. And you know what he did?" He paused, making eye contact with each boy. "He helped me up, took me to his backyard, and started teaching me karate. But not just the moves, he taught me why we train." Chris rubbed his arm where he bumped it earlier, though it didn't really hurt. "Why do you train?" he asked quietly, genuine curiosity breaking through his usual tough exterior. Mr. Wilson's eyes lit up at the question. "We train to build ourselves up, not to tear others down. Every punch you learn to throw teaches you why you shouldn't throw it. Every block shows you how to protect not just yourself, but others too." Alex, who had been the quietest throughout the whole incident, finally spoke up. but you didn't hit us at all. You could have, but you didn't. That's the most important lesson. Mr. Wilson nodded approvingly. True strength isn't about hurting others. It's about having the power to hurt them and choosing not to. It's about breaking cycles of violence, not perpetuating them. Brad looked up from his cap for the first time. We've been real jerks, haven't we? His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the morning quiet, everyone heard him clearly. You've been lost, Mr. Wilson corrected gently. There's a difference. Being lost means you can still find your way back to the right path. He stood up, stretching slightly. The question is, are you ready to learn how to find that path? The fountain spray created a soft backdrop to the moment as the boys exchanged glances. The pride and anger that had fueled them earlier had been replaced by something else, a mix of shame, respect, and maybe even a spark of hope. The dojo where I teach youth classes is just 2 blocks from here, Mr. Wilson continued. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I work with kids who want to learn more than just how to fight. They learn respect, discipline, and how to be strong without being cruel. Tom's eyes widened. You still teach, even after. He gestured vaguely at himself and his friends, unable to finish the sentence. Mr. Wilson chuckled warmly. Especially after. You 4 remind me of so many students I've had over the years. All of them came in thinking they needed to prove something to the world. They left knowing the only person they needed to prove anything to was themselves. A jogger passed by, slowing down to look at the unusual scene. 4 teenage boys sitting quietly, listening to an elderly man with rapt attention. The morning had transformed into something none of them had expected when they woke up today. I'm not going to call the police, Mr. Wilson said, causing visible relief to wash over the boys' faces. But I'm going to give you a choice. You can go back to trying to prove you're tough by hurting others, or you can learn how to be truly strong by helping them instead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of business cards, weathered at the edges as if he'd carried them for years. My first class is free. After that, it's up to you to decide what kind of person you want to be. The boy stared at the cards he held out, each one bearing the name of his dojo and contact information. The morning sun caught the edges of the paper, making them glow slightly, like tickets to a different future than the one they'd been heading toward. The evening sun cast long shadows across the front of the Silver Pine Community Center as Brad stood outside, staring at the one business card in his hand. It had been 3 days since the incident in the park, and he'd walked past this building twice already, unable to go in. Tonight was different, though. He'd made up his mind. The sound of children laughing drifted through the open windows, along with the rhythmic count of voices. Ichi, ni, san, shi. Brad watched the shadows moving across the frosted glass, his heart pounding. His red cap was clutched tightly in his other hand, freshly washed for the occasion. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The smell of wood polish and something else, maybe incense, filled his nostrils. The main hallway was lined with black and white photos showing different martial arts poses, and at the end, through another door, he could see students in white uniforms practicing their moves. I was wondering when you'd come in, a familiar voice said behind him. Brad turned to see Mr. Wilson, dressed in a crisp black guy with a faded belt that had clearly seen thousands of knots. You've been pacing outside for 20 minutes. Brad felt his face flush red. You saw me? A good martial artist is always aware of their surroundings. Mr. Wilson smiled warmly. Come on, let's get you started. The next hour changed Brad's life forever. Mr. Wilson didn't put him in the main class right away. Instead, he took him to a smaller room and began teaching him the basics. The proper way to bow, how to stand, how to make a fist without tucking the thumb inside. Simple things that somehow felt important. Remember, Mr. Wilson said as he corrected Brad's stance, every movement has a purpose. Just like every choice we make shapes who we become. As Brad struggled with a basic blocking technique, sweat dripping down his face, he found himself thinking about all the times he used his fists to hurt rather than protect. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 3 days. To his surprise, Tom showed up the following week. He stood awkwardly in the doorway until Brad waved him over, a gesture that felt both foreign and right. Chris and Alex arrived the week after that, and suddenly the 4 friends who had once united to cause trouble were learning to channel their energy into something positive. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. There were frustrating moments when they couldn't get a move right, times when old habits tried to resurface. But Mr. Wilson's patience never wavered. He seemed to know exactly when to push them harder and when to let them catch their breath. One evening, about a month into their training, Mrs. Chen dropped by the dojo with a box of homemade cookies. Brad recognized her as the lady whose rose bushes they'd destroyed. The shame he felt was overwhelming, but before he could say anything, she smiled at him. "Mr. Wilson told me you boys have been working hard," she said, offering the cookies. "My roses are blooming again. Sometimes things need to be broken down before they can grow back stronger." That night after class, Brad and his friends stayed late to help clean the dojo. As they mopped the floors and straightened the equipment, they talked about things they'd never discussed before: their fears, their dreams, why they'd started bullying others in the first place. "My dad left when I was 10, Chris admitted, wringing out his mop. "I guess I thought being tough meant not letting anyone get close enough to leave again." Tom nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My mom's always working. Sometimes I did stuff just so she'd have to pay attention, even if it was to yell at me." Alex, who usually kept quiet, spoke up. "I was just scared of being the one getting picked on. Stupid, right?" Brad looked at his friends, really looked at them, maybe for the first time. "We're not those guys anymore," he said firmly, believing it for the first time. Mr. Wilson, who had been pretending to organize papers at his desk, smiled to himself. He'd seen this transformation countless times over his decades of teaching, but it never got old. Young people finding their way, learning that true strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. The next day, Brad arrived early for class, wearing his newly earned white belt with pride. He paused at the dojo entrance, remembering how hard it had been to walk through that door the first time. A new student was standing outside, showing the same hesitation he had felt. Without thinking twice, Brad walked over to her. "The first step is the hardest," he said, holding the door open. "But trust me, it's worth it." 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the dojo windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams as Brad adjusted his green belt for the third time. His hands were sweaty as he watched the group of new students file in for their first class. Mr. Wilson had asked him to be an assistant instructor, and today would be his first time helping to teach. Nervous? Mr. Wilson appeared beside him, moving with the same silent grace that had amazed Brad that day in the park. The elderly master's eyes twinkled with understanding. "What if I mess up?" Brad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The red cap that had once been his signature now hung retired on a hook in his bedroom, replaced by the responsibility of being a role model. "You will mess up," Mr. Wilson chuckled warmly. "That's how we learn. Remember your first day?" He gestured to the spot by the door where Brad had stood frozen in fear just 1 year ago. The memory brought a smile to Brad's face. So much had changed since then. Tom, Chris, and Alex were all regular students now, each finding their own path in martial arts. Tom had discovered a talent for the flowing movements of kata, while Chris excelled at teaching the younger kids. Alex, still quiet, had become the most technically precise in his movements. The dojo had grown too. Word had spread about the 4 troubled teens who'd transformed under Mr. Wilson's guidance, and soon other kids started showing up, some sent by worried parents, others coming on their own, looking for direction. The community center had even given them a larger space to accommodate all the new students. "Position for class," Mr. Wilson called out, his voice carrying the same authority it had for decades. Brad moved to his spot, standing tall beside his mentor. The new students scrambled to line up, looking just as lost as he had once been. "Before we begin," Mr. Wilson addressed the class, "I want to tell you a story about strength." His eyes met Brad's for a moment. Real strength isn't about who can hit hardest or yell loudest. It's about who can stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. As Mr. Wilson spoke, Mrs. Chen peeked in through the window, waving at Brad. Her rose garden had become the most beautiful in the neighborhood, partly because the 4 former troublemakers now helped her tend it every Sunday. It had become their way of making amends, but somewhere along the line, it had turned into something more. A reminder of how beauty can grow from the soil of past mistakes. The local police officer who used to chase them away from the park now stopped by the dojo regularly, sometimes joining in the adult classes. The park itself had become a safer place, with the older students often stepping in to prevent the kind of bullying they had once perpetrated. Today, Mr. Wilson continued, we have someone who's going to help teach you. A year ago, he stood where you're standing now, unsure if he belonged here. He gestured to Brad. Now he's one of our most dedicated students. Brad stepped forward, his heart racing but his voice steady as he began, demonstrating the first basic move to the new students. He caught glimpses of his friends at their usual spots, Tom grinning encouragingly, Chris giving a subtle thumbs up, and Alex nodding in quiet approval. After class, as they cleaned the mats together, Brad found himself sharing wisdom with a new student who was struggling with a basic block. It's not about being perfect, he heard himself say, echoing words Mr. Wilson had once told him. It's about being better than you were yesterday. Later that evening, Mr. Wilson sat at his desk, looking through old photographs. He smiled at a particular image, a newspaper clipping from 6 months ago showing him with his 4 reformed students at a community service event they'd organized. The headline read, Local Youth Lead Anti-Bullying Initiative. Your grandfather would be proud, Mrs. Wilson said softly, bringing him a cup of tea. She had watched the transformation of not just these 4 boys, but countless others over the years. He always said one act of kindness could change a life, Mr. Wilson replied, sipping his tea. Even when that kindness looks like standing up to someone who needs to be stood up to. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Brad and his friends were walking home together, their gym bags slung over their shoulders, talking about the upcoming tournament where they'd be competing not against others, but against their own past selves. The story of their transformation had spread beyond their small community, inspiring other dojos to start similar youth programs. Mr. Wilson's phone regularly rang with calls from martial arts instructors across the country, asking for advice on working with troubled teens.